Preston, nice to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you.
So I just heard your talk. Honestly, I wanted to see what you thought now about Kephalē, now that we had this conversation in January, I guess.
Yeah.
And it was ETS last year that you came by the booth and we talked linguistics and stuff. So how have you developed since then? And how is your, I know you still say, I'm still working things out.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you're closer to, a position on some of these issues? Particularly the meaning of Kephalē.
Okay, Kephalē,
Let's start with that.
I feel fairly confident that the Greek word Kephalē, in its extra biblical uses and in the Septuagint, when it's used in a non-literal sense, conveys some kind of authority, especially when it's being used in relation between people. Because sometimes Kephalē can be like the Kephalē of a river,
Right.
When it's inanimate objects, I don't think those are as relevant, but when it talks about a general of an army being the Kephalē over his soldiers, it just, people that say, no, that's not authority, I just don't see how they can say that. So, and I would love to hear your thoughts on the dead and living metaphor, if I even got that right today, because I kicked that around a little bit, but we don't have a ton of ancient references, so Paul does seem to use it in different ways in Ephesians. Ephesians 1, when he says Christ is Kephalē, I think clearly talking about the supreme authority. But then in chapter 4, when he uses it with regard to the body and supplying the sort of spiritual energy to the body, I could see where source of spiritual nourishment or something like that could be, the general sense of what he's getting at there. But in the big one's in chapter 5, right?
Yeah,
chapter 5, man is a head of, or the husband's the head of his wife as Christ is the head of the church. I think he is using Kephalē in a sense of authority there, but I do think he's reinterpreting how a first century reader would have understood authority.
Yeah.
So he meets them where they're at, uses an image that conveys authority, and then sort of turns it on its head to interpret authority as service towards his wife. Now, I think, and there's other scholars who have kind of argued for that, and I think that is the best way to understand what Paul's doing there. That authority in this narrow sense, in this specific argument, is service. Now, the only other time Paul uses Kephalē in male-female relations is in 1 Corinthians 11:3.
Which I think is way harder than Ephesians 5.
Way harder.
Way harder.
Okay, so now, I don't know, because I think what Paul's doing in Ephesians is not easy, but I think it's pretty clear. I feel pretty confident with my understanding. So in the back of my mind, I am kind of thinking, okay, well, he uses this metaphor in husband and wife relations in 1 Corinthians 11. Is he doing something similar?
Yeah.
And as I think, generally speaking, I think so. I think he is using an image that the Corinthian readers would have understood, and he is sort of, I don't want to say completely turning it on its head, but he is introducing a more fuller perspective of what it means to be, the head or source of woman. Now, okay, so source.
Yeah.
Now I'm asking the question. If it's a living metaphor, that means we are to pay more close attention to contextual clues for him to define what it means, because we can't just assume the word will automatically be understood by the audience.
Right.
How would you?
So when you say something like "time is flying by,"
yes,
right? That's a metaphor that we just have in our language.
It's a dead metaphor.
Yeah. In the sense, So if we're defining dead and live in this way, dead being conventionalized. Let's
conventional.
Say. Yeah. And so a live metaphor is like it's on the fly. So we're having a metaphorical use in this specific passage, and we can't necessarily conclude something about the meaning of that word, right? So if I can say Preston is an elephant, right? And we don't have any conventional, metaphorical meaning to that. Now I can supply a context. Something about elephants and
if we're at the zoo,
right?
And we're both watching an elephant just devour a bunch of food, and he said, "Hey, you're such an elephant."
Right.
That means nothing unless people know. Preston likes to eat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if I called you a pig out of the blue, everyone knows what we mean.
Okay. Yeah.
Right, because that that metaphor is conventionalized in English,
Okay.
right? So that would be, so yeah, the question is, kephale, I think clearly has the ruler sense conventionalized, right? Does it have some of these other senses conventionalized? That's much harder to argue for without more data.
So in 11:3, 1 Corinthians, he says man is a head of woman.
Yeah.
Then he talks about literal heads for the next couple of verses.
Yeah.
And then he goes back into, I think, unpacking the deeper sense of man being a head of woman, and he bases this in the Genesis 2 creation account. And there he does talk about the woman coming from man. And so there it does seem that there could be some sense of source that is connected to kephale, but I don't think source without authority, though, because I think he is driving at the authoritative position of the husband represented in the head covering that he's telling women to put on.
Right.
So,
I think, too, the question, there is a distinction between, I would say, like what the word kephale is giving you in the context and what the context is giving you, right? So it's not that you wouldn't have to necessarily import the source meaning into kephale, right? Because he could be talking about sources and authorities at the same time, right? And I think that's exactly what's going on in 1 Corinthians. I mean, under my reading of 1 Corinthians 11, again, my kind of naive understanding of 1 Corinthians, I mean, you've done way more work on it, but certainly he's talking about sources. Right, and it seems like certainly he's talking about authorities, right? So he's doing both of those things, right? So I mean, abstracting away from like what does kephale mean? Well, like you could just say kephale is talking about the authority. I mean, clearly, again, I think it has those. It has that as a conventionalized meaning, right? It could also maybe be being used as this source live metaphor, but regardless, he's talking about both things at the same time. Right. So it could be that kephale is just talking about authority when he's talking about authorities in 1 Corinthians 11, and source is honestly source is the ek tu andros, right? Ek tes kunaikes, like those are clearly source. That would
but you would say if somebody tried to argue that it means source and not authority because of what he does with Genesis 2, you would say that's you're squeezing too much out of that.
My thing would be, let's say, like, okay, if we're uncertain of what the word means here, let's go to other places and see like what the word means in clearer context, right? And if you go to those other places, like
Ephesians
as you
5,
have, right, it's like, okay, it means authority.
So it would be valid if there is if there's a much clearer meaning in Ephesians 5. You say that's we should definitely take that into consideration when the meaning in 1 Corinthians 11 by itself seems to be a little more ambiguous.
Right, exactly. Because we can't, I mean, ideally we would ask Paul, like, what exactly did you mean by that here in this specific passage? We can't do that, right? So what we can do is we can look to other places that are clearer, right? I would say the same thing, I can't remember who it was that we were going back and forth on the blog. But some passages in Philo, right, where it seems like kephale could mean something like source, but I would say, well, that's just clearly a live metaphor. I would say. And so in that context, sure, right? I can say it means that. But if I don't have clear examples outside of those, then it's hard for me to interpret that as a conventionalized.
So in certain places, it could be a live metaphor when there are clear contextual, connections to the word.
Exactly.
That are necessary, that are being drawn out from the word.
Exactly. And so and that's I think very clear in those Philo passages. And it could be clear, I think, you could argue for it in Ephesians 4 maybe. Again, the metaphor of the body. But even there, it's like, the body head metaphor is so often authority, with the head.
Yes, I agree.
Anyway, one of the things I found very intriguing was the in the Lord piece. If we could just end with this, but I want to hear your thoughts on it a little bit more. As I was thinking about it, I was thinking to Ephesians 5, and thinking there is this sort of new world order, right? Now that the Lord has come, things are different. And I think this could fit actually very well with the reading of Ephesians 5 that you're suggesting, right? That now the authority, what it means to have authority has changed, right? And so now what it means to be a husband and a wife has changed in the Lord, right?
Right.
I mean, I think that connection strengthens us reading these two passages together. I mean, I don't know if that's exactly what you were saying.
I think so. Yeah, I actually didn't spend enough time really thinking about the connections between what Paul's doing in Ephesians 5 with what he's doing here. I was just so really steeped in 1 Corinthians 11. But yeah, I do. I think it's fair to say that there's something about verses 7 to 10, maybe even 3 to 10 in 1 Corinthians 11 that's not in the Lord. Like, it's just such an important climactic contrast, you know? However, in the Lord, and he's in verses 11 to 12, he's directly connecting even the prepositions, the ek and dia interchange is like he's clearly interacting with what he just said. So there's something that's not in the Lord in the previous section that does feel a lot more hierarchical.
Yeah.
Woman is the glory of man, and woman was created from and for man. You know, it's like, ooh. You know, Which again, if Paul never said in the Lord, and that's I think it's a straight reading of creation, but he does seem to offer some different perspective in verses 11 and 12.
Well, so. and I thought you bringing up Galatians 3:28. I mean, I think that's exactly what's going on there too. You know, it's like there's no longer male or female. Right. It's like, you know, I mean, that's, you know, obviously in your space a very important verse. But there is like some sort of, I mean, it makes me think like husband and wife is not in that, you know, list in Galatians 3. Right. There's no longer husband and wife, but it feels like that's what's happening in 1 Corinthians 11. It's like there's no longer husband and wife in the Lord, right? There is now, like they're both equal in this sense that we're talking about, right? And in the same way, there's no longer male and female, no longer slave and free. It's like now in the Lord, we're all the same.
Yeah, the social statuses that these identities have are sort of nullified in Christ, right?
Yeah. So even husband and wife, you know, this like creation thing is in the Lord, in the new creation.
Yes.
Do
you think, I mean, you as much as you followed my argument, do you think kind of Galatians 3:28 is kind of like, man, I think that's an airtight summary of kind of what Paul is probably doing there?
I think, I mean, I just, you know, pulled up the two passages. I mean, I think that's to me, that is the kind of key to that verse, right? Is that he's drawing on that same idea from Galatians 3. And at that point, again, my reading would be, your reading that I'm, kind of ripping off of is just that there's no longer husband and wife, right? In this sense.
Yeah, in this sense. The categories of husband and wife bring these social hierarchies, but once you bring those into Christ, they're sort of modified, challenged.
It's tough. It's like...
And yet he still does want people to abide by the social signals that in and of themselves carried maybe a sense of hierarchy and authority.
Right. It's not that we're getting rid of male and female completely or slave and free.
Right.
I mean, you can see that in Paul and in other places.
Right.
But there is a sense in which like now husband and wife they're just the same. In the Lord.
So that's good. Yeah.
Anyway,
man.
I really appreciated it. And,
I appreciate it. Thanks for coming.
And I'm looking forward to the podcast, the 2.5 hour.
Oh man, It was long.
Yeah. So thanks a lot for coming on and sharing your thoughts here.
My pleasure.